So first, thank you for the very elaborate analysis of the situation in Estonia. And thank you also for the invitation. And I hear myself with a delay of 2 seconds. Yes, that's better. Okay, so urban shrinkage is actually a wicked problem, as Krista also pointed out. So where to start and what to do. And I would like to add in the next 10 to 15 minutes a different perspective from the Netherlands. That's where I'm working from. And get a bit out of the data and get into the reality of urban shrinkage and introduce some practices that we've been working on. And so the area of Parkstad, which is the region that I'm talking about, is the former mining region of the Netherlands. And it's actually situated in a very small part, the smallest part of the Netherlands, in between Germany on the eastern border and Belgium on the western border. And actually the mining coal fields actually spread from the west in Belgium to the Ruhr area. And we are quite in the middle of that. So it's actually one coal mine field. And the last 10 years, IBA Parkstad region has started a internationale Bauausstellung, which is actually a German format instrument for revitalizing weaker areas. So perhaps in urban planning land, the IBA Emscher Park is very famous. IBA Berlin is also very famous. And for example, IBA Emscher Park, they conceptualized and also did very many projects on how to repurpose urban heritage and industrial structures. So it's a 10-year-long regional framework and program. And the starting point of the IBA Parkstad was actually the situation of urban shrinkage. So how to address this wicked problem, where to start. And so the program is now in its final year, in the Expo year, and there have been 50 projects of really different nature and character. I will mention a few later on. And topics such as reuse, repurpose, heritage, and citizen participation have actually been on the main front of many of these projects. What's important, I think, for this internationale Bauausstellung, and what's also important for urban shrinkage and how to address it is that they can make some space for small-scale experiments. Because we all don't know how to cope with urban shrinkage, and we are very much used in planning in a growth situation that we really have to learn by practice how to do this. And I'm currently also working on the final publication for this IBA Parkstad. And so one of the things that I listened to today was also how urban shrinkage is a very dynamic process. And that's really true, because whereas at the start of IBA Parkstad 10 years ago, Parkstad was a declining region, and the prognosis were actually very, at least for Dutch context, not very prospective. So aging and demographic decline. But today, actually, the demographic situation is different. So there is no shrinkage anymore. It's actually flattened out. And so the prognosis on which IBA Parkstad started have actually very much changed. And so this is an example of how urban shrinkage is a very dynamic process. And in the Netherlands, a lot of policy has been built on the basis of demographic prognosis. They are often very linear, but they don't take into account the changes that can occur. Another aspect of a dynamic process, which has also been mentioned, is that there is growth within shrinkage. And in my area, this is very much concentrated in social economic weaker areas. So you get a sort of stapling concentration of multi-level problems, because one of the strategic intervention that the government made was to take out a lot of social housing stock. but they are also concentrated in social economic weaker areas. And as a result, also facilities, educational, cultural facilities will also retreat from these areas, which will perhaps even strengthen a downward spiral. So maybe one more example of how demographic decline is also on a European level a dynamic process is the German area, the rural area, and the city of Duisburg, which was also a shrinking area, a shrinking city until 2015 and 2016. And due to two developments, the first one of being the new member states, Romania and Bulgaria, they had a lot of influx of these residents that came to Germany. And the second, of course, being the refugee crisis, which in only 5-6 years turned the city of Duisburg from a shrinking city into a regrowing city. This particular image is taken in the quarter in Duisburg, Hochfeld. And it's called actually Little Schumann, and this is referring to the city in Bulgaria, Schumann. And as you maybe know, Bulgaria is one of the fastest shrinking areas, countries in the world, actually. So there is also a broader dynamic process going on in Europe, where we see that many former industrial cities in Western Europe, in the Netherlands, in Germany, are not shrinking anymore, but we see also a increase in Eastern European cities. And there is also this relation between them. So I listed also some phases of urban shrinkage. And so, you know, the first phase of being in denial and shock, and then create awareness, and then have some analysis. And we have benefited a lot of all the analysis and research that has been done to the phenomenon of urban shrinkage in the Netherlands. But I would like to focus on the phase of experimentation and to highlight why this is very important. And I would also would mention that a shrinking area is very fit as a testing ground for urban degrowth practices. And I mention this because I think the fact that we are not growing anymore is actually a very much broader societal phenomenon, because how to cope with the lack of growth is perhaps the most important issue that Western governments face. So I also try to turn it around in my projects and to take away findings that are beneficial also for areas that are not shrinking. And so to focus, to narrow down a bit more on experimentation and why this is very much important, I will show you some examples. The first being the sourcing of ideas, because I very much believe that citizens have good ideas and that you can source them and also get broader and good ideas beyond the planners and policymakers. And I did a project last year, which is called the Degrowth Daily, which is a crowdsourced newspaper. And my idea was to gather positive prospects from all different kind of layers in society, and to actually bundle them in this newspaper. And it's not so much only about the result, but it's also about the dialogue and the conversation, and to try to get people a positive outlook on this phenomenon, and not only frame urban shrinkage as a problem. And it was actually very successful. We had a lot of contributions from very different disciplinaries, from not only landscape architects, but also from designers, citizens, and scholars, which inspires also the policymakers and the planners to perhaps think beyond their own discipline. A second example is as well as on the hardware, but also on the software of how to cope with actually a surplus, an abundance of residential areas. And we had a lot of these type of structures, 9-story high, from the 60s, typical structures that were built when there was demographic growth. I think we have still 20 of those, always in an ensemble of 6 or 8. And of course, when you look at modern standards, they are very, very difficult to adjust. But one of the interventions that Ivar Parkstad did was to address these type of buildings and to use modern technology, but also modern standards when it comes to sustainability, and also think of safety, because a lot of residents in these buildings are older residents. But one of the nice dimensions, I think, also was that art was used. So 6 of these giant walls are used by famous muralists to create a sense of attractiveness, but also a sense of belonging for the inhabitants. So it's not only about hardware and software, but also about mentalware. So it actually helps people feel at home in these areas, even if it's a shrinking area. And the opening was very nice, and even a group of citizens is organizing tours. So normally they would not come across these type of art forms, which is specifically, I think, for a younger audience. But by doing this, they were very enthusiastic, and they organized tours for people who are art lovers. Another example of a small-scale experiment, and also a strategy to cope with vacancy. This is typically an example of religious heritage. We have a lot of churches in our area, and half of them are not being used anymore. And there was this initiative from the local community who are very much involved in music, to think of the idea of why not make this into a cultural center. So this is a quite nice idea, I think, of how you can repurpose existing stock, and perhaps not get too fast to the strategy of demolishment, because as we witness in our region, the prognosis are very much changing. So, and there is also, I think, a sort of regret that too many buildings and too many social housings are already demolished 10 years ago, while now we are very much in need of these type of residential dwellings. A final example is very much on the hardware. So these were similar 9-story high buildings, and 4 of them, and 3 of them are already demolished. And it was demolished by using principles of a circular building. So actually they made an analysis of all the material that was used, and also looked how can we reuse the material in new buildings. So one of the small experiments that they did was actually to build this pavilion, and it consists totally of building materials from one of the demolished flat buildings. So it's an example of circular demolition, and it is a small scale experiment of building a circular economy, which I think is one of the strategies for shrinking areas. And perhaps I can show you a small video of this experiment. So these were just a few examples of why small scale experimentation really can help in finding strategies. And some of the examples are actually being upscaled because they, besides that, a lot of lessons were learned. They also showed that it helps to also involve the local people in having a more positive outlook on the future in a shrinking area. So thank you very much. And I'm hoping to one day visit Estonia to see the actual situation also that are behind the data. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to questions.